This is a recording of our Introduction to Learning While Working Framework webinar. This isn't actually a recording of the live webinar. The live webinar actually has a whole series and ranges of interactive activities. What we're doing with our recordings is removing those and doing a separate recording where it's just me talking about the essential content. So if you're listening to the recording, you're actually only getting a segment of the experience. You're not getting your peers interacting and giving advice about certain things and some activities, some brainstorming around some of the examples and things as well. But it hopefully fulfills the need for people who want to catch up on the webinar if you weren't able to attend. What the webinar is going to go through and what the session in this recording is about is discussing the Learning While Working framework a little bit more. And then the big feedback we quite often get from webinars is people want to see more examples of the 70-20-10 model in action. So that's going to be, we're going to look at 3 different examples and look at the framework in action in those. So first of all, a little bit about the Learning While Working framework. The Learning While Working framework is actually 2 things. It's the manifesto, which actually sets out a need for change in learning and development and a need for a different way of going about thinking about developing learning solutions and a learning environment in our organizations. And then the second stage is the framework to give structure to that. So I think there's 3 driving forces in our modern workplaces. I think of them the 3 C's, and they're incredibly entwined with each other. They're really complexity, change, and collaboration. By complexity, I mean what's actually happening in work and our work environments is that decision making and the set of responsibilities we're having to take on is increasingly becoming more complex. A really good example of this is something like insurance underwriting, a complex decision making skill that's about risk management. Progressively, more and more of this is being able to be done by artificial intelligence and using big data to be able to inform the decisions. So essentially, some of the tasks that used to be done by an expert are actually now being done by computers in terms of smart work. We've seen the move to a knowledge economy, and what's now happening is that knowledge economies, meaning we're all having to become smarter in our own workforces and our own times, and our jobs are changing quickly. Part of that driving force is that, as I talked about big data, artificial intelligence, but generally the big word around this is we're being digitally disrupted very quickly. And that's creating huge amounts of change in our organization. It goes without saying that every organization is in flux. Its organizational structure is normally in flux. What the customers are starting to want is in flux. And if being able to be in that spot in learning and development where we're enabling that change is incredibly powerful. Now, the other thing that's happening at the same time is that as this set of complexity is happening, there's a set of really interesting things around different types of experts needing to collaborate in different ways. You see it in sort of healthcare with needing patients having to move around from one specialist to another specialist, or in other industries where essentially the narrow depths of knowledge becomes so precise that it actually needs quite often 2 types of experts to collaborate to be able to make things happen. It's also just a new workplace skill to be able to collaborate and work with your peers. Probably not actually a new workplace skill, probably a universal workplace skill to be able to collaborate with your peers. There is some really interesting ways and means that digital technologies enable collaboration in new ways as well, and that's one of the things that's quite exciting about this. Now, the way I think about this and the way I think about the 3 C's is it means that everyone should always be learning while working. There's no separation between learning and no separation between working. As you're working, you're trying to improve and continuously think through ways of making what you're doing better. Is that better for your clients, faster for your organization, smarter ways of doing it, and growing as a person and human at the same time. that you're always in that spot where you've got a growth mindset. Now, I think at the core of this is the 70-20-10 learning model. It's a really powerful way of explaining how we really work and learn. The fact that in actual fact most of our learning does come through that 70 of experience, but we still need our peers and our managers around us to help support that. And the 10 is sometimes still needed in models as well. So it's not actually saying, and I think this is one of the powerful things, it's not saying completely that one is the dominant thing. It's this mixture of things. Now, a little while ago in a webinar, it clicked for me that in some ways I think of the 70-20-10 idea as a concept and model. It's not actually, for me, a framework. A framework needs to have a lot more going around it. And that was my realization that essentially in some of the work Sprout Labs was doing with clients, we were building that framework. And in some ways the learning by working framework is the writing up of what we've been doing with that work. So it's actually about sort of taking that 70-20-10 model and concept and implementing it and making it a reality and how to translate it into practice. The Learning by Working framework, I'm calling it a 0.9 version. There's already bits and pieces inside of it that I want to revise with the next version. I think it needs a lot more detail as well, and as I do more webinars and talk more about it and actually use it more in our practice, now that it's actually written down as a way of working, I'm sure it's going to expand over time. So it's actually three things. It's really a process which is based on design thinking, which also means a mindset as well around design thinking. Over time we'll drill more into that, and then there's a series of what we call design patterns and then some principles. Today's webinar is really drilling into some of those principles in practice and what they really look like when you actually have a learning model for that. I'm just going to quickly go over some of these other bits. What's design thinking? The definition of design thinking goes something along the lines of the application of the processes and thinking patterns that product designers, visual designers use for different business problems. So to bring those sorts of balancing things which are both combinations of analytical skills and creative skills to problems that are normal business problems. And design thinking has its own sort of separation out into different areas like service design and user interface design. So it's a sort of, for me, it's personally a balancing between a set of analytical skills and a set of creative skills. And it's a set of creativity for purpose, and that set of creativity for purpose is defined by the analytical skills. It means that it can actually open up and be more organic and more holistic and be in a spot where you can look at things in a very different way. You're not working in an analytical way where you're sitting there going, we're in the analysis stage of ADDIE where we're designing a course. It allows you to be able to sit there and go, okay, so here's the business problem. What sort of solution looks at that? So the steps around design thinking and the language we're talking about is this process. At the bedrock of it is understanding, and I think that's three things to understand: the business problem, the learners and where they're at, and then the context the learners are working in as well. So it's this sort of understanding and developing this deep emotional picture and intellectual picture of what those three things are. In actual fact, using that word emotional, what I'm trying to get at is I'm trying to say that rather than your learners get treated as people and the learner-centered approaches become a natural outcome of a design-centered approach. It's not sort of added on as another thing. The next phase, we're calling this exploring. Some people call this ideation. Really, this is about coming up with ideas, quite often co-designing, and then the processes of exploring sometimes merges into prototyping as well. So it's essentially trying to sort of think through, well, we've figured out this is our problems and this is who we're working with and what our outcomes are, what could be our possible solutions. And at the beginning of the prototyping phase, it's sometimes really low fidelity things. It might be some of the journey maps or some of the visual maps we'll look at later. It might be more things like role plays and more sort of complicated prototyping as you're getting into things. In part of the process of design thinking is a deep approach to storytelling to communicate things, because essentially in a 70-20-10 design is not one thing, it's a complicated, complex model that's multi-layered, and I think stories are one of the best ways of being able to embed those. In one particular design document, we had a series of stories about different ways learners would navigate, and one of the fascinating things was some feedback that came from one of the key players was, this won't work. And what was interesting was that person was going at a personal level, the model meant a massive level of change for them, and they couldn't quite see how that particular learner experience was going to work. What that was actually was also a red flag that person, when it came to implementing the model, wasn't fully on board and struggled with the model. So that was a really sort of interesting thing that we could actually see in hindsight, see that red flag inside of the stories that happened at the implementation stage. Now the next two stages I'm sort of struggling a little bit with, and this is the sort of thing that I'm probably going to be in a spot where we might change the naming around this, but it's essentially the testing and evolving stages of the what we normally think of the implementation and evaluation stages in learning. The reason I've used the word testing is to generate a different way of thinking about implementation. That what you're actually doing is putting something out there, you're looking at it, you're seeing how it's going to go, and then you're going to change it quickly, hopefully, and improve it quickly. So essentially you sort of go back and forth between that sort of testing and prototyping very quickly. And the evolving is actually to put the evaluation spot in that spot where it is continuous improvement that's acted on really quickly. And sometimes some of the tools that are actually used during the evolving stage are the same as the ones that are used during the understanding phase as well, because it's about sort of examining, looking, and really thinking through what's really happening, what's going right and what's going wrong. Cool. So to drill into the principles a little bit, principles are there to really guide the decision making. Principles are an interesting approach. We quite often use them in strategy documents with clients, because I feel like putting a principle in place sort of puts a guidepost in the ground, something to hang other things off. It doesn't lock things down too much. And if you're putting together a strategy that might be for something that's for 2 or 3 years time, it actually gives the organization and L&D a set of flexibility around how they might actually embody that and how they might actually work with that principle in practice. So essentially that was what we're trying to do with the principles, is give some guidance around decision making, but not locking things down into this is what a 70-20-10 model should look like, because that's the beautiful thing about 70-20-10. It is a really flexible model and a really flexible way of thinking. That's really about realigning to a more holistic way of thinking and a different way of thinking around learning and development. That I don't want it to be seen that these principles are rules that you have to follow, is the best way that's another way of saying that. So we're going to look at 3 examples in practice. One of them is about, and these examples are sort of built from a mixture of client projects, projects we're talking with clients about, and an added layer of fictionality to it all as well. So essentially they are just sort of a bit of a mash-up rather than actually talking about particular case studies of projects we've worked on. So the first one is sales skills in a financial sector organization. The second one is reducing errors that lead to customer complaints, and onboarding in a government organization. So this first one, someone's come to L&D, sitting there saying they want to reduce errors that lead to customer complaints. Now what's really awesome about this is it's in a spot where this particular one has got a business outcome to it. Wouldn't it be great if the business always came to L&D with a business outcome first? But not that quite normal spot where particularly this person's jumped to exactly what they feel like the solution for this should be as well, which is they want the managers trained in lean thinking. Now I always think there's a little bit of an irony in this whole training around lean thinking, because in some ways with lean thinking the last resort to process improvement is actually training. So the first thing in lean thinking is always to systemize, change the environment, change the process, and then only use training as the last resort. But then at the same time a whole culture of training people in that thinking around how to do that happened. So this is actually an interesting one, because this is in terms of our design patterns that we've got in the framework, which is this notion of generating knowledge, or is it the problem to do with introducing new knowledge into an organization, or is it sharing? This is actually about really generating new knowledge in an organization. This whole notion of L&D being responsible for generating new knowledge and innovation and new practices is a new idea for L&D. So it is one of the actual ones that's more challenging. It's also one of the ones that I'm possibly going to rework in the next version of the framework, because I've sort of always put this down as being about creating new knowledge. I think it's actually a balance of creating new knowledge, and sometimes some 10 has to come in as well. So we use these learning design maps to visually map out how programs run. We will be getting these up on the website sometime soon, so you can download them, because they're essentially releasing them as Creative Commons, so anyone can use them. We print them out as sort of AO, big plan size things. Quite often use them with sticky notes in workshops. Quite often split the workshop team into multiple teams to develop multiple models, come back, share, and then work on the other side of it, and then make a decision about which one's the best one. The 70-20-10 models are not always easy to explain, and I think visual tools like this are one of the ways of being able to explain them. So, because also this actually has a layer of sequencing to it as well, that essentially a solution to this problem, it's not the only solution to this one, would be to bring a consultant in to run a lean project. So essentially being in a spot where people can see how it's happened. Then managers actually go and visit other, just jump forward, managers go and visit other organizations that are working with lean thinking and see how it's happening, so they're bringing in new knowledge. And then the core of this is this notion of process improvement projects, and the consultant then acts as a coach for those participants. Now, recording and reflecting is really important, so the actual project reporting is used as a way of being able to blog and reflect on that as well, and then to add another layer of connection and shared reflecting and sharing learning, a community of practice between the participants is formed. So to just quickly run through and just have a look at some of these design approaches and the principles in practice. And I actually don't want to go through all of them one by one. I think this is actually the core of this particular model, is really this process improvement and being able to take on projects. And the projects also mean that people can practice, fail, try again. A project in an organization is essentially a change, We don't want projects to fail, but sometimes they have a little bit of a curly, threaded path to get to their outcome is the best way to put it. Particularly, I think project-based learning in the workplace or project-based learning in more formal learning situations is one of the most powerful ways anyone can learn. They have to take responsibility for their learning. They have to be self-directed about it. It quite often actually gives people a different set of responsibility. And then in some ways the rest of the learning model is really just one way of supporting project-based learning. Because you've got possibly a cohort in this particular situation, it does make things a little bit easier. So you can do things like the community of practice. Sometimes a challenge if you're a manager and one of your team members is on a project that's outside of their normal scope of work. Supporting them is sometimes a challenge and not always an easy thing. So this sort of more systemized, scaled up approach that might be driven by L&D can be easier for everyone. Now, on to our next problem. Improving sales skills in a financial sector organization. Essentially, businesses come to L&D saying they want to improve the consultative sales skills of their advisors. The interesting thing about this as a model is this is actually a classic L&D activity. Bringing new knowledge into an organization. Someone saying we need to be able to do something in a different way. Really, it quite often starts in the 10 and then transfers into the 70 and supported by the 20. A lot of the ways and means of approaching these particular problems of new knowledge really draw on the whole area of learning transfer. A couple of features of the area of learning transfer just quickly is normally what's called spaced repetition happens, that learners engage with that, employees engage with the content over a period of time. The managers normally put firmly at the center of the process, so they take responsibility for the transfer of that into practice. So the map for this would look something like this. You'd start with possibly together a simulation-based workshop, so essentially a series of role plays, and essentially role plays, feedback, modeling, so the advisors get a real sort of experiential and performance-based approach to it. Then part of that workshop would be setting a getting better goal. It's been repeatedly found that when you set goals which by their nature are learning goals of I'm going to improve such and such by such and such percent, actually makes people behave in a different way. Put this growth frame set and mindset on rather than a sort of fixed mindset of, oh, I have to sell so many widgets. If you have to improve your sales of widgets by 5%, that gives a really different feel to things. So next part of the model is virtual classrooms to do check-ins. Virtual classrooms, an awesome bit of technology. One of the things I love about them is that they can be so visual. Using things like the whiteboards mean they can be so interactive as well. They also have the flexibility that people can actually just pick up the phone with them as well, and people can actually do them quickly, and we're progressively seeing smaller virtual classroom sessions happen as well. They don't always have to be hour-long sessions. So coaching and for the participants in the new skills over a period of time, and then also integrating a program for the managers as well. So the managers are actually supported in and given direct guidance in how to help make these new skills happen for their teams. So last but not least, essentially the learning transfer part of this work is held together by a mobile app that sends a few things to the employees, reminders about what their goals were, and tracking their goals, and then practice activities. So if they've sat there and said the one closing on a sale is the bit that they need to work their skills up, then that would send practice activities for them to keep on remembering and practicing what those skills were. And then the great thing about this new type of reporting called Experience API means that things like these mobile apps can go back to your learning records tool. Specifically with things like this where there's good goal tracking built in, what that also means is, and some of the learning record tools are doing this extremely well, you can actually track a goal and a performance outcome against training. So you can actually see if people are actually going well on tracking and improving their goals. You might be able to see, oh, okay, so they're using the app in this way, or they're not using the app in that way, and get that understanding from that. So the few things here around the principles at play. The first one is really at the core of this is that measurement has been put at the top and is really important, and that it's being measured by a change in performance. The 10 is not content based, it's actually performance based and based on decision making. There is a series of activities around this that are around coaching and social, and then there's the mobile app is actually what's been used to allow for decisions to be made over time. And some of these apps we're starting to work with clients on as well, work in a way where they're what we call adaptive, where essentially the client, if someone does well on one area, they don't get any more questions or practice in that area. If they don't do well in another area, they get the opportunity to keep on doing more practice in that area, so that it actually becomes more personalized to their actual needs as well. So, last but not least, onboarding in a government organisation. And essentially, it's not just we want to onboard people, but they want to decrease the time it takes for our staff to become proficient. And this is an interesting one because it's a classic one we've seen quite often, and classic use of digital technologies and e-learning to be able to get people up to speed faster in organisations. I also think there's a bit of a risk around this. I'll talk a little bit about in a moment. So this is a classic one where it's actually a sharing knowledge. You're sitting there saying, this is the way we do things in the organisation. This is what we expect from you in the organisation, and it's a sharing knowledge. So it would have been one of those things, and it's a classic apprentice model. And apprentice models are both used for trades as well as, I'm not quite sure if people realise, quite often the people we think as some of the most highly skilled people in our organisation, in our world, doctors and specialists, essentially their training model after their initial university study is mostly apprentice based, working with a supervisor, someone guiding them and progressively letting them do more and more, and then constantly giving them work feedback in the workplace. So orientation is one of these things that's really a sharing knowledge pattern. What's interesting about it, and this is where I need to change some of these patterns a little bit, it is sharing knowledge, but that sharing knowledge can be accelerated by the documentation of that and the codification of that and the practicing of that using 10. So essentially it's an acceleration by using some more formal learning around time. So this particular approach has taken that approach of using a apprentice approach of essentially someone mirroring an experienced person, being given someone that's a role model that they can see how they're doing it. Then that 10 is actually a series of simulated based work before they commence on real work, using what are called worked examples. And worked examples are essentially the first step in them is an expert explaining what their thinking patterns are around solving a workplace problem, and then they scaffold it in a way where the learner starts to sit there and go, okay, so on to the next example, they start to make some of the decisions and start to do some of the process. And then over a period of time, the scaffolds are removed to the stage where they're ready to do real work, but they've actually practiced different parts of the task incomplete multiple times. So then they're also supported in a community of learners and learning partners, because I think part of this whole bringing someone into an organisation is socialising them to an organisation. One organisation I worked in for a while had there was a group of people who'd been there for 20 years, and that cohort of people had gone through an orientation process that meant, for one cohort of people, meant 2 weeks residential workshops. And I realised that had, and they talked about it as well, they talked about the deep social connection and deep network and trust that they built with those people that were part of that cohort that they'd done that residential work with. So I think one of the things in orientation we need to start to think through more is actually how to socialise people in the organisation, and communities of learners and learning partners and mentors and buddies are part of that. Then really at this particular stage, a manager needs to be focusing on coaching and getting people ready for being able to do work. Then if you remember back, the business problem was about proficiency. We have a really fantastic competency-based system in Australia, and a competency-based system that can be used in lots of different ways to be able to actually measure proficiency and its measurement of actual performance. Not always in the way it's always implemented in the TAFE system is actually not actually how powerful it can be in the workplace. So don't dismiss that notion that competency-based systems can be used in workplaces in fantastic ways. Cool. So some of the principles at play, essentially that by being able to measure performance using competency means that that's put right at the top. The manager is incredibly entwined in this particular one, and there's a socialization through the learning partners and the communities, and hopefully they're using that time to reflect on what they're learning and sharing that as well. So quite often I personally think of learning as happening when people actually share what they've learned, and then they articulate what they've learned as well. That sharing and articulation, because we all experience things in the world, and we keep on sometimes doing the same things over and over in the world, but we don't actually pick up the new skills to be able to do that in a new way. And it's the articulation, reflecting, and getting feedback as well that clues into the new behaviours. So thank you everyone, and I should have changed this to thank you everyone for listening to this recording, and hopefully it's been a good replacement for the webinar.